Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What role is there for the United Nations in the 21st century to help eliminate the scourge of war, to promote economic and social development, and to enhance human rights? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. You're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view some of the previous shows. Also, if you have an interest in our programs and would like to help distribute them, please feel free to go to the website and download them. Global Connections Television is independently produced and it is provided as a public service so that we can learn more about what's going on in international relations and how international issues impact us no matter where we live. So again, please take a look at it. If you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps a university that has an intra-campus television hookup, or even just a website, and you would like to share the shows, they're provided at no cost. Today we're taking a look at the United Nations in the 21st century, and my guest today is the acting director at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, Kentucky, USA, and that is Dr. Karen Mingst, who has written an extremely interesting and timely book, and her book is The United Nations in the 21st Century, 5th edition. And so you can tell how popular it is since it's in its fifth deliverance here, shall we say. Dr. Karen Mingst, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
I appreciate you being with me. Karen, let's jump right into this. And what is basically, I guess the title says it all, but what's the thrust of your book and as far as the UN and its role in the 21st century?
Well, the book is in part designed for students and is used in universities in the United States and actually around the world to introduce the students to the various factions, the various areas that the United Nations is involved in. I think if we have a thesis, is the argument that the United Nations can do some things, and it does some things fairly well. It can promote ideas, it can help set agendas, it can develop partnerships with non-governmental organizations, with states, etc. But to be realistic, there are some things that the United Nations can't do. It does not have those powers. It cannot enforce agreements. It cannot act quickly in crises. And this is extremely important and obviously sometimes very devastating. So there are things, and I think as a public and as students, we need to realize about what the UN can be used for, but also what are its limitations. And these are purposeful limitations. The five powers who were involved in the setting up of the United Nations clearly did not want the United Nations to be as strong and as powerful as perhaps some people think it should be.
And there are a lot of misconceptions about the United Nations. One is it's a one world government, which it is not. It's a collection of 193 countries. Basically every country in the world is a member of the UN General Assembly. Secondly, so often you hear it undermines the sovereignty of the United States, which is not correct. But as you mentioned, there are things the UN can do and things it can't do. And I think just back to the Syrian situation, which is a terrible tragedy we see unfolding every day. The UN Security Council, which has agreed on a lot of different issues, but Russia and the United States could not come to an agreement on Syria. Yet by the same token, the UN agencies were on the ground in harm's way helping people stay alive in Syria by providing food, maternal and child health care programs, helping with human rights in that area, and also with refugees. So there are parts of the UN that are constantly working, even when other parts can't come together on it.
Right, and that's exactly right. And with respect to peacekeeping, you have to get agreement on particularly the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And if you don't have complete agreement, then you are not going to be able to take unified action. Now, there are other things they can do, but it's certainly much more limited. But as you said, the panoply of UN-related humanitarian and economic development organizations and its partners, the non-governmental organizations, the refugee relief organizations, they can be in partner and deal with the humanitarian fallout, the humanitarian crises that have emerged from that. But until you get agreement from the 5 members of that Security Council, you're not going to solve it except perhaps on the ground, which is unfortunate and what we're seeing at the current time.
And closely tied to what you're talking about, many people say, or many observers who look at the UN say, the UN is just the institution. It's really the member states. You mentioned the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, China, and France, who were basically the victors of World War II, so they wrote the UN Charter in 1945 to set it up the way they wanted to. But it's often said that if they do not cooperate and coordinate, it's really up to the individual states, especially the most powerful ones, to spell success or failure for a UN program.
Well, that's right. I mean, and partly that is the funding which comes from major donor states, which, by the way, are not necessarily the major states that have the power in the Security Council. So that Japan or Germany, for example, who are major contributors to the UN, are not represented on the Security Council. But as I said at the outset, what really, the enforcement provisions of which are there, but it still has to, they don't have their own military. The UN does not have a military. It has to call upon member states to contribute military. There's no overarching military command. So exact enforcement has to be through the states. And there are many times when the UN acts in a resolution which you would think there would be enforcement, but states decide not to do the enforcement. They decide that in their interest not to do enforcement. And unfortunately, sometimes that means the UN is blamed as an institution, but what we really need to talk about is the unwillingness of states to actually do the work that would be necessary for enforcement.
I want to get into peacekeeping in just a minute, but I'll go back to the funding of the United Nations. That's another really myth that's out there. People think we pay all this money into the UN and we get nothing back. I could make the argument that the U.S. benefits more from the United Nations than any country in the world. We don't have time to do it today. But as I recall, the UN on peacekeeping, the U.S. pays its fair share. We're at that now, paying about 28%, 27%. But on the UN budget, the UN Secretariat, we're only paying 22% of the budget, and we should be paying 28% based on our wealth. So there's a disparity there as to what we pay.
Well, and that percentage has gone down over time.
Right, exactly, it has, sure.
And there are some, I mean, there's an argument. I mean, it's clearly in the United States, there are some who should say we shouldn't be paying any, and there are others who argue that in order to keep our more privileged position, we actually should be paying more.
Right.
And any attempts to look at other ways to fund the organization, the United States is actually opposed, which is through some kinds of foundations, because this would take away the power that the United States does have because of the power of the purse. But we're actually talking about not very much money in contrast to
very small,
you know, as they say, the police department of New York City.
That's our fire department has a bigger budget than the whole United Nations system, but the UN is worldwide and it accomplishes a tremendous amount. It doesn't, as you mentioned, it doesn't accomplish everything. But before we get off peacekeeping, the UN right now has 16 peacekeeping missions, about 110,000 troops on loan, police officers on loan to the UN. These missions are in some very dangerous areas: Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Central African Republic. They have one in Haiti. As we think back to the 90s, the U.S. military was in Haiti, but we passed the baton to the UN. How devastating would be if we were to cut our funding to UN peacekeeping. And for example, the UN had to pull its troops out of Haiti, and we had to send our military in, which we would, and it would cost 8 times as much, according to studies, to have the U.S. in a peacekeeping mission as opposed to the UN. But what are the reasons to support?
For most of the places that we're talking about, the U.S. is not going to
It's
send
not
in
going to
troops.
go. The Democratic Republic of Congo, right?
It's not going to go,
That's
and
for sure.
the U.S. is not going to go to the South Sudan.
No.
So, you know, these are crises which are really quite peripheral to what many view as the U.S. national interest. They are important for peace in a region and in a sub-region. And to the extent that in the case of the South Sudan and the case of Darfur, maybe that Islamic terrorism is involved in Mali or in the Ivory Coast, then they become more important for U.S. interests. But I don't think it's going to be an equivalent situation. The U.S. is not willing, and I think it would only cause controversy for us to be involved in those. And that's the purpose, to have more neutral troops involved in these areas. But it is increasingly difficult to get countries to volunteer their troops, to contribute their troops. They are paid, obviously, but it's still difficult to put their own troops in harm's way in places that many view as quite peripheral to their own interests.
And of course, peacekeeping is a highly visible part of the UN. It was not even mentioned in the Charter in 1945, but it became pretty obvious. You had to have intervention in some dangerous areas in order to try to bring peace and stability. Right. The UN, as you mentioned, depends upon donor countries. You get differing levels of training as far as the troops are concerned. You also have a situation where some of the troops do not follow the military code of conduct. They violate, there's been a handful of troops like in Haiti, some in the DRC, that have traded sex for food. The UN has a zero tolerance policy. When that happens, the troops are gone. How important is that to get them out and to make sure, or try to make sure that their countries deal with these troops, because they're the ones responsible? Yeah,
the troops do remain, and this was part of when the founding fathers put together the UN. They did not form a unified military command, so those troops still are under control of their own national military leaders. So sometimes, as you suggest, those people who have offended or traded sex, involved in sexual relationships, have been ousted from the country. Not all of them had been punished, and this is part of a very black spot on the UN. Sends a very poor message, and something that clearly everybody is working hard to prevent, but that has not happened, and it does send a very poor message about the UN as peacekeepers.
And even as I look at these missions, and I don't study them to the degree you do, but as I look at the missions, I think, it's terrible that you had some Uruguayan troops, a handful really in Haiti, that did some atrocious things. But given the entire mission and the fact that even with these problems, if the UN were to pull out, I just think of what horrific massacres would take place, how much devastation would be there. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, it would be just absolutely terrible.
Well, as for most of these, I mean, the violence goes up and down. So right now, things in the Congo are much quieter.
Right.
But, I mean, we don't know exactly. What we really hope for is that there will be some kind of a peace settlement, and you would achieve, some stability in post-conflict. And that's why the UN has been increasingly involved in more post-conflict activities, trying to set up and establish governments, develop police presence so that you deal with violence and criminality that is often part of the post-conflict environment. So it's I think when peacekeeping developed, it was fairly narrow, and now it's much more extensive in terms of peacemaking and peace building, trying to develop a much more holistic approach to it.
We were talking about the individual member states and the 5 permanent members of the UN. Think back to 1945, or a little before 45 really. It was President Franklin Roosevelt who was really the architect of the United Nations. It was his idea, and unfortunately he died a few weeks before the UN Charter was adopted. But the U.S. has been a leader in the United Nations since its founding, 71 years ago in 1945. How important is it for the United States to be involved in the UN, to play a leadership role? Because I mentioned before, we do benefit from the UN. We benefit from peacekeeping. We benefit from helping our aircraft move safely in international airspace, our ships, Holland America, whatever, on the high seas, helping to move mail around the world, weather information. These are all services that we receive, but other people do around the world also. But how important is it for the U.S. to be a leader and to be actively involved at the UN?
Well, clearly, I mean, U.S. leadership is critical, and that's why under different presidential administrations there have been a lot of animosity about the UN. Sometimes it's been election issues. In the 1980s, it was a major election issue, both in terms of U.S. participation and U.S. contributions. There have been very strong anti-UN non-governmental organizations. At one point, the Heritage Foundation, that was their sole being, was to delegitimize the United Nations. So I think what was interesting in the recent political environment is the United Nations, actually, there wasn't much discussion about that in the electoral campaign. There really wasn't much discussion on international issues writ large, but there was very little actually about the UN that was discussed peripherally, but not. But I think there are certainly people that have been talked about for a new administration who are very anti-UN. And we'll have to see whether these people get prominent appointments in the new Trump administration.
Mm-hmm. One thing I've noticed over the years as I've talked about the UN to various groups, Rotary clubs, whatever, faith-based groups, church groups, that so many politicians, talk to them in particular, that so many people do not understand what the UN does. They think it's all peacekeeping or all Security Council, but there is so much more to the United Nations that we never hear about. And when people learn about the UN, they say, I didn't realize the UN did that. I didn't know it was helping to move Delta Airlines internationally to Japan or to London. And that really resonates with people. It's just amazing how much support there is in the United States for the UN, but there's so little information about what the UN does.
Yeah. Well, I guess you could make that same argument about a lot of areas of foreign policy.
Well, it's true.
Right. Foreign policy is not very high on the agenda.
Not a hot topic.
Low information. So I guess it's not particularly surprising. But, a lot of the UN activities, you mentioned a few that directly affect the United States, but clearly in other countries, there are activities in which the UN is there all the time. I've worked a lot in Africa, and clearly in a lot of African countries, the UN has a very strong and viable presence, whether it's in health or whether it's in economic development or whether it's in social welfare, whether it's with refugees, etc. So there is variable understanding of what they are, and of course they're not present in everyday America in the same way that they are in other countries. That's why we write the books, and that's why we offer courses in the university to try to, but not to paint too rosy a picture. I mean, this is an institution formed by governments that had their own interests and will continue to have their own interests. But as you said at the very outset, it's really important that you recognize that it's not a world government or anything close to a world government. It is an institution whose members are sovereign states, and they're able to do a lot of good things, and they're not able to do some things that many people wish they could do.
Mm-hmm. One very good thing that has been done was the Iranian nuclear arrangement, nuclear deal, a little over, a year, a couple of months ago, that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany came together along with the European Union and a few other folks to crack this deal with Iran to help make sure that Iran does not develop the nuclear capabilities. We've heard so much misinformation about this. I hear people saying, politicians in particular, saying, we just gave Iran a $150 billion gift. No, we didn't. It was only $54 billion, and it was their money. We froze it. And in fact, if we'd gone to an international tribunal, we probably would have owed them the 150 plus interest, and so it would have been even more. But how important is that deal to make sure that Iran does not go nuclear, at least for 10 years?
Well, I personally think it's extremely important. It's also extremely controversial, as you don't know. It's particularly controversial in Israel. I happened to arrive in Israel the day after it was signed, and shopkeepers, taxi drivers, everybody was railing against the Iran deal. I think now they have pulled back a little and recognized that it's probably in their long-term best interests. So I think it will be interesting to see. It is an international agreement. It's not going to be one that the U.S. can easily, quote, pull out of, nor do I believe that it should. But again, we anxiously await who the new advisory team is going to be and who and what their positions are going to be on that issue.
Exactly. And if the U.S. does pull out, the other 4 members of the Security Council said they're going forward with it, with Iran. That'll put the U.S. on the sidelines. We will not be involved in the discussion, will we? No.
I mean, and I think that's probably the one thing that may hold it together is a recognition that you can't just end the deal. There are too many countries involved. But you can certainly weaken it, and I think it will depend on, I mean, the UN, again, they were a facilitator. They were sort of there at the table. The nuclear energy or related agencies of the UN have had roles in that and will certainly be involved in the monitoring process. And the monitoring is one thing that the UN traditionally has done very well, monitoring as long as they get access into the country. And so far, that has been successful, but we'll have to see.
And of course, another area that is of great importance to people around the world is climate change. And the scientific data prove that climate change is happening. You may not agree completely with it, but it's happening. And the problem is, when will catastrophe strike? It's already hitting some of the islands in the Pacific and that type of thing. The weather patterns are changing. The UN was instrumental in moving this discussion forward. Ban Ki-moon, the outgoing Secretary General of the UN, played a critical role in this. Why is it so important for us to stay involved and, again, not to fall back into this pattern of relying on fossil fuels? Fossil fuels, coal, for example, their days are numbered. No matter what is done, gas is putting coal out of business. But how important is it to stay involved in these discussions and to move forward to try to reduce that carbon footprint?
Well, as you know, I mean, it became a very political question within the United States, and it probably will continue to be a strong political question. The science is there. The rest of the international community is certainly moving forward, but to go all the way, the U.S. clearly has to be involved. Now, I think in this case, a lot of industry is already moving, and the alternative energy industry is already moving. So in a sense, the politicians may be behind the egg ball in this, particularly in very affected regions of the United States, like Kentucky, where we live, a coal-producing state. But in other parts of the country, I mean, clearly changes are made which are clearly influencing the environment. And what I see happening is, I mean, the UN is sort of the global role, but really what you're seeing is much more participation by local governments, by local groups all over the world, cities, and the UN is serving in the partnerships with those kind of organizations to promote that agenda. So there again, the UN playing sort of the overarching role in terms of creating and helping to facilitate these partnerships, but they're involved in alternative energy, et cetera. But in this case, you know, whether the U.S. national government is just left behind on this whole issue looks very probable under the present circumstances.
And if you're not part of the discussion, you're not part of setting the agenda. It's just a fact of life.
You're
no
not
matter
at the
where
table.
You're not at the table. You're sitting in another room. Hardest question, Karen, last 30 seconds. What is the major problem you see confronting the United Nations as we move forward in the 21st century, as you've written in your book?
Well, I think the new Secretary General, he just came from the UN Refugee Agency, and this refugee problem is a major one that I don't think is easily going to be solved. Not in terms of numbers, not in terms of countries accepting these people, not in terms. So I think this is going to be a major humanitarian issue, which is in fact going to continue, regardless of what our state institutions do.
Well, Karen, these topics are so important. We didn't get a chance to get into Sustainable Development Goals, but we would encourage our viewers to Google SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals or go to www.un.org. But Dr. Karen Mingst, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.